flowers, but I do actually enjoy pulling weeds. I just like to pull them in the garden where they're getting in the way of my tomatoes, and I don't have the same compassion for flowers as I do for tomatoes. But I go out into the backyard, and I tell you what, it's very satisfying to pull weeds. You go out, and you're just going to check one thing, and then you see a big clump of crabgrass right in a day and a half. It's gotten this big in the garden, and you just have to lean over and pull it. And you kind of grab and wiggle a little bit so that you can get the roots out too. And you know you've gotten the roots, then it's not coming back. All right, that's satisfying. And then even though that's not what you came to do, then there's another one. It's only about 3 inches away, maybe 4, so you lean and grab that one, and before you know it, you never did put on gloves. It's been 40 minutes, you've got dirt everywhere, and there's an entire patch that is just clear. Nothing there except what I want to grow there. Well, that's pretty satisfying. Even more satisfying is, and all of this is because I'm one of those hippie California girls that doesn't like to spray things on my plants, so I have to use the manual method. So I've got a tool that is for dandelions. And you get it down in there, and you just leverage it just right, and you can get 2 inches of root out. And you know that one's not coming back. My kids and my neighbors have learned to just ignore the muttering that comes from the garden. You do not belong here. We do not need any mulberry trees in this garden. One more. Go join the pile of your dead cousins. Once I get started, I kind of get on a roll and it's hard to stop and I lose track of time. Matthew's community knew about weeds. They knew about weeds. And the story that he shares from Jesus is partly because they were living in the midst of weeds and trying to sort out what does it mean to follow Jesus in this context. And this story we hear reminds us that yes, there are weeds. Evil is real and active in our world, and God, who is grace and mercy, is not impressed with hatred and violence. That is nothing but a weed. God, who is justice, does not find all behavior to be equal. We are called to a certain way of living, to a fruitful way of living, into living the way of the kingdom. And Matthew says, yeah, there is a difference between the way that God's kingdom operates and the way the world operates. And then, did you catch this? He also is very clear to say that these bad things that happen, these invasive and unwelcome hurts in our world, these are not the will of the sower, right? Those weeds that crop up were not because the person sowing these things just did not care enough, or even sort of thought it would be amusing to see what happened as the weeds competed with the wheat, and let's see how this all works out. This is not the will of God, Jesus says. God did not sprinkle temptation around the world just to test our faith. God did not sow tornadoes and cancer and layoffs and that one person through our lives just to help us grow. No, sin and evil exist in this world, and they are not the will of God. Matthew wants his hearers to hear very clearly Jesus' words that this is not the will of God. But we know, don't we, about how life can be a mixed field? How where we expect goodness to be, sin sprouts right up next to it. Maybe you've had the experience in families or friendships, healthy ones, with relationships that are mostly defined by love. Still, self-interest kind of creeps in, doesn't it? And impatience and jealousy and pettiness. In churches where we practice week after week confessing, receiving forgiveness, sharing God's peace, receiving the self-sacrificing love of Jesus in our hands, his body given for us. Still, we hold grudges, we do dumb things, we're suspicious of others' motives, we fail to love each other beyond the surface. A couple weeks ago, we heard earlier in Paul's letter to the Romans where he says, I find it to be a law that when I want to do what is good, evil lies close at hand. The weeds and the wheat are just all mixed up. And when we have some really good thing given by God that is a blessing, well, sin finds a way to ride right alongside, doesn't it? A relationship that should be good that really turns to be a bit manipulative. food that is wonderful and life-giving that turns into a coping mechanism that's not healthy, or into a control that we aren't eating what we need to in order to be healthy. Again and again, the wheat and the weeds are so close together. And so it's no surprise that the slaves, they're not happy about this. They're angry about the weeds, and they're ready to yank them. We like to yank weeds, right? We like purity in our culture. Whether that is politics or any other sort of community, we like to make sure we've got everyone in line. We want to pull the weeds. We are willing to prevent something good in the name of perfection. Right? We're not, this isn't good enough, I only want that. There are still some weeds here, we can't have it until we can get our way, and only our way, and completely our way. We will drive members out of our political parties or our protest marches because they are not conservative enough, or they're not liberal enough, or they don't have the same issues as I do, and even though we agree on one thing, we cannot possibly be church together because, look, we got to pull the weeds. A friend talked about this, the way that the Soviet government sort of devolved from an ideological clarity about what we're about, and the enemies that were named were all on sort of the opposite side of the political spectrum. But soon enough, enemies were left, right, and center, because anyone who didn't play the game the way I wanted and act the way that the government thought it should be, well, you're all enemies. We're just pulling weeds left, right, and center. We love to pull weeds. We get on a roll, it's hard to stop. We just keep yanking and grumbling under our breath about what's wrong with this one and that one and those people over there, and it's satisfying to be on the right side, and we start pulling up everything in our path. Pruning's the same way. I have occasionally lopped off an awful lot more than needed to be taken off because I was going. It was good. And Jesus' story says, no, it is not your job. It is not your job to pull those weeds. You do not have the judgment. He tells me you do not know the damage you are going to do. We would love to pull all the weeds. We'd like to get this sorted out for ourselves, by ourselves, and right now, thank you very much. And Jesus says, no. What you get is the promise that there's someone who actually knows the difference between weeds and wheat, who will do it at the right time and in the right way. God is going to sort this out. Not that nothing matters, but that it is not our job to pull the weeds. Paul talks about this waiting with eager longing, about waiting for adoption. It's hope, he says, hope in which we were saved. And if we're hoping for something we don't see, we're waiting with patience. We live in hope. Think about how God's kingdom, that Matthew is so passionate about, how God's kingdom comes into the world. Jesus is God's kingdom come into the world, and he doesn't come by force. He doesn't come playing the game the world plays, but better, harder, and meaner. He comes and begins the reign of God on the cross of all places, where it looks like the weeds have won. The weeds have choked out the most beautiful, glorious gift of God that angels sang about on a cross. And then, after allowing the world to do its worst, even after all of that, Jesus is there in the flesh, standing in front of his disciples, showing them God has another way. That the good seed, the love and mercy of God endures no matter how we are going to try to trample it. And so we live in hope, waiting for God's last word instead of our own, and knowing that that last word is good. We don't get to pull the weeds. And sometimes that's disappointing because it's very satisfying to root them out. And it's disappointing because that means sometimes that we're living with very difficult things in our lives and in our world. But we also know that that is good news because it's a mixed field in here, right? And if weeds were getting pulled, I am not sure from one day to the next whether I'm weed or wheat. Both. All of us have that. And if weeds were getting pulled, an awful lot of things would get ripped up. And we do not know always even what is good and what is not. We have in the garden purslane growing. There are lots, I've got a whole forest of weeds. There's a wide variety, but one of them, purslane, is kind of succulent, and if you leave it be, it gets very large. It seeds itself year after year. I'm pretty sure it's in the compost that I bring in from the city every year, and it just starts to sprout up, and if you don't get everything out, well, it'll grow right back again. And usually I just trample across it for a while, and eventually when I get to yanking weeds, out it comes. But I've known for a couple of years that it's edible. I saw it on the internet when I was looking up how to cook my dandelions, which are not delicious, just so you know. But it was worth trying, and purslane apparently is edible too. And so I happened to be gone for 2 weeks this summer at just the right time for it to grow large. And I decided, well, I'm going to be pulling it. It's actually, maybe there's enough there to be worth trying. And it turns out it's pretty tasty. We had good soup. We had some salad. It's free food. Growing in my garden, I have to put forth no effort. No bugs eat it. It comes back when you rip it up. It might be a weed or it might be magic, right? God has a better sense of what is a weed and what is not than we do. And God has this habit of adopting weeds over and over. I mean, that's what we do in baptism. We are not God's chosen people unless you happen to be of the Jewish faith. You are not God's chosen people, and neither am I. We are adopted. In one definition, we're weeds. But God has this habit of adopting weeds. And so I am glad, and I think we can all be glad, that we get to wait and let God be the one who decides what is weeds and what is wheat, because God knows better than we do, and God has the ability to make changes that we do not. So we wait in hope with thanksgiving. Thanks be to God.